Chicago, a metropolis consumed by vanity, a city that never sleeps. Here, every morning brings new opportunities and choices, and although the world seems open to the bravest, it hides many dark corners. Behind the facade of successful careers and harmonious families, there are stories full of secrets and sins. The story of Kyle and Tamira is one such example. Kyle and Tamira, a couple living in one of the suburbs of Chicago, at first glance represented the perfect family. Their life was full of routine: work, household chores, children. Kyle, the eldest, was always family-oriented, and Tamira, although a beautiful and charming woman, felt from the very beginning that something was missing in her life. She was inclined to search, to something new that she could not find within the framework of her usual life. This is how their story began. One day, after several years of marriage, they decided to try something different, something that would awaken new feelings and deepen their connection. That's how they entered the world of swinging private gatherings where couples like them sought sexual freedom by breaking away from old norms and traditions. For Kyle and Tamira, it became a game that they perceived as a way to get closer to each other, experience new sensations, and strengthen their relationship. From time to time, they attended private parties where couples swapped partners and did it on their own terms. Tamira, like many women, felt over time that her search was not limited to the physical. She was looking for emotional intimacy, for something more meaningful. And at one of these meetings, she met him, Jeff, the man who would soon become not just a chance encounter, but a key element in her life. Jeff was older than Kyle, and that added some appeal to him. His self-confidence, charm, the way he spoke, all of this attracted Tamir, but most of all, she was attracted to his gaze. He was attentive and sincere. With him, she felt not just a woman, but a part of something bigger. Their meeting was not accidental, and there was an instant chemistry between them which soon developed into an intimate relationship. Tamira tried to keep it from Kyle, at first thinking it was just a phase that wouldn't affect their lives. She consoled herself with the thought that it was just physical pleasure, that nothing serious would happen. But the more she saw Jeff, the more everything changed. His touch, words, and looks evoked more and more emotions in her that she couldn't ignore. But she was married, and although Kyle didn't suspect anything, her inner world was gradually being torn apart. When Tamira found out she was pregnant, her life was turned upside down. At first, she was in shock. She couldn't believe that the moment she had so easily made the decision to date Jeff had led to this. She couldn't figure out what to do. It was all so complicated. Her feelings for Jeff and her attachment to him were growing stronger, but she had a husband, a family, and the thought of losing it all was crushing her heart. Tamira decided not to tell Kyle who the father of the baby might be. She knew that question would ruin their relationship. She would lie to him, hide the truth, and hope that maybe it would somehow work itself out. She decided that maybe Kyle would never know the truth, that she would be able to hide her secret relationship with Jeff. And if Kyle decided that the baby was his, she would accept it. But Tamira didn't know how much her lies would begin to destroy her. She felt more and more lost every day, and her conscience would not let her rest. Many times she woke up at night, thinking that she needed to tell Kyle everything, but she could not find the strength. It was too dangerous, and she knew that one mistake would lead to the destruction of their family. Meanwhile, Kyle continued to live his normal life, unaware of anything. He was ready to support Tamir, deciding that her pregnancy was a chance for their family. He did not know that his life was about to change forever. Tamira felt how her love for Kyle changed, how she was torn more and more between the two men with each passing day, not knowing how to resolve this difficult situation. At this stage in their lives, there were no obvious signs of destruction, but something was already beginning to crumble, undermining the foundation of their relationship. The thought was growing that this secret would lead to a tragic end. With each passing day, Tamira felt her life drifting in different directions. A battle began in her head: guilt, shame, the desire to hide the truth, and, at the same time, fear of possible consequences. She could no longer ignore the fact that her relationship with Kyle was not what it used to be. Swinger parties, where she and her husband had once sought new experiences, were now just an empty ritual for her. Her attachment to Jeff was growing stronger, and with each new look, gesture, word, he consumed her more and more. Tamira couldn't decide if she wanted to continue living safely with Kyle or follow her emotions and feelings that she feared were tied to Jeff. He was there. He supported her. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't ask questions she didn't want to answer. He was who she could be with him. There was no judgment in his eyes, just acceptance, something she couldn't find in her husband. She began to make decisions based on her hidden desires. Meetings with Jeff became regular, and even if she tried to pretend that their relationship would not develop into something more, reality increasingly made her realize that her lie could not last forever. Kyle was busy with his work, which absorbed all his energy. He spent a lot of time in the office, returning home late after Tamira had already put the children to bed. He did not know that his wife had long ceased to be the woman he loved. He saw that she was confused, tired, but it did not occur to him that there was something more than just stress hidden behind her mood. Tamira carefully hid her inner duality from him, disguising herself as a caring mother and wife. Despite her best efforts to control her feelings, Tamira began to feel that her relationship with Kyle was crumbling. She tried to hold back, avoiding nighttime meetings with Jeff, but her heart was no longer with Kyle. Jeff filled her thoughts, and her body responded to his touch with such force that she could not fight this inner desire. One evening, when Kyle returned home, he noticed that something was wrong. Tamira was sitting on the couch, seemingly lost in her thoughts, unaware of his presence. He assumed it was just fatigue from everyday worries, but his anxiety did not go away. He tried to be more attentive, asking questions, trying to spend more time with her, but Tamira avoided communication. She could not look him in the eye, knowing that her inner world was far from what she showed him. Tamira could no longer hide her feelings and began to avoid intimate relations with her husband, which immediately attracted his attention. Kyle began to feel that his connection with Tamira was somehow changing, that the spark that once made them close was gone. He did not know what was behind her silence. He perceived her aloofness as a consequence of fatigue, work, and home routine, but inside he was growing questions to which he could not find answers. That evening, when Kyle left for another meeting, Tamira felt her body, as if freed from the shackles of conscience, reach for the phone. There was not a single phrase in her messages, correspondence with Jeff that could give away their secret affair, but she knew that she was not the only person in her husband's life. He was hiding something too, and although Tamira could not prove it, her inner instinct told her that Kyle was not as pure as he seemed. There was something akin to betrayal in this which left her soul torn. The tension between them grew with each passing day. Kyle noticed her changes more and more often, but he couldn't comprehend that it all had much deeper roots. He felt lonely and on the verge of depression, trying to figure out what was wrong with his marriage. His feelings for Tamira remained strong despite her estrangement, and he was ready to fight for their relationship. But with each passing day, more and more unnecessary suspicions plagued his mind. Not wanting to reveal all her cards, Tamira continued her two-sided deception. She knew it would all come out one day, but she couldn't predict when. The lies were becoming unbearable, and her feelings for Kyle and Jeff were filling her like flooded walls heading for destruction. At this point, each of the characters already felt that something was about to happen. Their lives were on the edge. Tamira couldn't hide her secret for long, and Kyle, although he didn't know what was really going on, felt that his marriage to Tamira was becoming more and more distant and alien. The world of swinging, which had started as a simple game, had now become a dark and painful part of their lives that threatened to destroy everything they had once built. As each month passed in this growing chaos, the effects of Tamir's secret affair began to become more apparent. Jeff and Tamira continued their secret meetings, like echoes of something that had once made sense, but was now just an empty, sterile game that had become part of their daily lives. The emotional tension continued unabated, and more people were drawn into their secret relationship. At first, it was a game for Tamir. She told herself that everything would be under control. She was looking for the passion that was missing in her marriage. She felt that something important was missing in her life, and she saw in Jeff the very person who could fill that gap. But despite her self-confidence, she knew that this game could turn out worse. And now, with every step she took, it became obvious. The hidden consequences led to the risk of destroying her entire world. Kyle became increasingly immersed in his work, where he was a professional. He couldn't understand what was happening in his personal life. His relationship with Tamira was not bringing him joy, but perhaps he still believed that it could change something. However, the internal feeling of loss and emptiness in their marriage was becoming more and more obvious. He began to turn to his friends for advice, but one question kept spinning in his head. Why was his wife pulling away? And why couldn't he find what used to connect them? Kyle had several personal, stressful situations at work which at some point gave him a reason to ask questions about his family life. He became increasingly aggressive, which was felt not only at work but also at home. Tamir's silence became an invisible wall for him, which was impossible to overcome. He began to feel that something was wrong, that his wife was hiding something important. But how deep his suspicions were, he could not imagine. Meanwhile, Tamira knew her life was about to spin out of control. There was no room in her heart for guilt. She justified her actions with internal reasons. She felt she deserved better than Kyle could offer her. She saw her encounters with Jeff as a way to restore the sense of life she felt she had lost in becoming a mother and a wife. But the more she tried to hide her true desires, the more they crept into her consciousness, making her reach for what was her secret source of freedom. One day, as she was walking home from another meeting with Jeff, Tamira felt a strange heaviness in her chest. That nervous, heavy moment when everything that was hidden could be revealed. She didn't know how Kyle would react if it all came out. She was afraid of the destruction of her family, but there was something more important in her life, her connection with Jeff, which was now almost everything to her. Kyle, returning home, noticed her strange behavior. He could not understand what exactly was causing her anxiety, but he felt that it was not limited to fatigue. They were both becoming unrecognizable to themselves, and Kyle suddenly felt his heart squeeze. He did not yet know that this was the moment when all the lies were about to be revealed. Tamira increasingly avoided her husband's direct gaze. Her actions became less predictable. Thoughts swirled in her head that soon she would be forced to make a choice, to continue hiding her feelings or admit that her heart had long been away from him. Each day brought Tamira more doubts. She felt how her feelings for Jeff grew stronger, and each new day removed her further from the life she led with her husband. As Tamira questioned herself, she began to realize that there were hidden aspects to Kyle's life that she hadn't noticed. His aloofness and isolation became a mirror in which she saw herself reflected. She felt trapped, trying to hide the truth from her husband, but inside, that last barrier was melting away. An unsettling feeling began to brew in her soul that just one moment would open the floodgates to the destruction of what was left of her family. Tamira couldn't hide her feelings any longer, and her life seemed to be pulling her in two opposite directions. But one way or another, her secret life with Jeff couldn't last forever. The decision she had to make was inevitable. Kyle was becoming more and more distant, and her inner conflict was becoming more and more acute. But by this point, even Jeff was starting to feel like things were getting too complicated. He wasn't prepared for what was happening, either. His feelings for Tamira were deepening, and he wasn't sure he was ready to continue this game. What had seemed like a harmless secret at first was now part of a dark and dangerous dynamic they had created for themselves. With each passing month that Tamir and Kyle's relationship continued to fray, more and more signs pointed to the impossibility of repairing it. Jeff and Tamira, like two figures playing a hidden game, continued to destroy everything that had once connected her to her husband. Tamira stopped pretending for a while that her relationship with Jeff wasn't affecting her marriage. Sure, she tried to avoid overt conflict, but her inner world was already shattered. Every morning, Kyle grew more tense. He slept less and less. More and more often, he was consumed by his thoughts. The look in the mirror reflected a lost man. He didn't understand what was happening in his life, and he couldn't find a way to get his family back on track. Sometimes, when he drove home, he felt himself being pulled toward his car, ready to drive off into the unknown. But that was the key to his inner conflict. He didn't know what he would do if he left. Tamira remained the unattainable ideal he had once loved, and losing her meant losing his sense of who he was. Jeff continued to pursue his goals. He didn't want to lose Tamir, but he had his own problems. His life wasn't perfect, and his relationships with women had always been unstable. His contact with Tamir had become more than just a passing passion. She was an extension of him, a secret part of him that he didn't want to reveal to anyone, including her husband. He began to think that he was losing control of the situation. He wondered more and more often what would happen if Kyle found out about them. Meanwhile, Tamira felt the pressure mounting. She increasingly saw her life being torn apart, two worlds unable to coexist at the same time. There were moments when she tried to talk to her husband, but even when she opened up, her words seemed useless. Kyle no longer took her words seriously. Their conversations lost their meaning, as did her attempts to explain what had happened to their relationship. She spent a lot of time thinking about how her feelings for Jeff had grown into something more than just physical passion. It was like being immersed in an inexplicable storm. Every touch, every look, every moment with him began to take up more and more space in her life. But despite her affection for Jeff, she couldn't shake the guilt she felt toward her husband, who was still willing to save their marriage. One such evening, when the silence in the house was almost palpable, Kyle found himself in his office, working on his financial reports as usual. But this time, his mind wasn't on work. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life wasn't going the way he wanted it to. He kept seeing images of Tamira spending time with Jeff while he was left out. He knew something was wrong, but he still found himself trapped in his own doubts. These thoughts haunted him day after day. What if Tamira never came back to him? What if her feelings for him were gone forever? It was a terrible thought, and he continued to torment himself. He knew that Jeff was not just a friend, but a person with whom his wife could share her inner world, including the things she could not talk about with him. But there was still a spark of hope in Kyle. He couldn't bring himself to fully believe that she had cheated on him. Often, when he returned home, he tried to understand what had happened in their relationship. But despite his efforts, he could not find the real reason for their breakup. Tamira was an enigma, and he feared that her secrets might be too deep for him to understand. With each passing day, the tension between the couple grew. Tamira increasingly avoided her husband, and her absence from family dinners became obvious. She felt trapped in her role as wife, mother, and lover, but every time she looked at Kyle, it became increasingly difficult to hide her weariness with this image. Tamir's emotions when she was in the room with her husband were now subtly suppressed. She no longer felt the comfort and security that his embrace had once brought her. With this internal crisis, She began to notice how her relationship with Jeff was beginning to stretch to the limits of what had bound them together. The further Tamira drifted away from Kyle, the more she drifted away from Jeff, though it was hard to admit to herself. She couldn't stay in both worlds, and every day it became harder to keep their openness a secret. Jeff, for his part, felt trapped by his own decisions. He couldn't continue to live a double life. He and Tamira weren't just lovers. They were entangled parts of what was, in essence, a crime against himself. More and more thoughts were running through his head, as were Tamir's. What if Kyle found out about them? With each passing day, the atmosphere in the house grew more tense. Everything that had connected Tamir and Kyle seemed to be fading into the past. But despite the apparent destruction of their relationship, Kyle himself continued to cling to the last vestiges of hope. He still loved Tamir, but his love was now so wounded that it seemed almost painful. She was moving away from him with every step, every look, every silence. He saw how her behavior changed. She avoided him, spending more and more time outside the house, disappearing with friends and not even explaining where she had been. Outwardly, she remained the woman he once admired, but inside she had become alien. Her former caringness was gone, giving way to a cold aloofness. Tamira was deeply conflicted. On one level, she knew that what she was doing with Jeff was unlikely to lead to anything good, but her attachment to him was so strong that she couldn't just give up on it. But at the same time, she knew that her life with Kyle could never be the same. It was as if their relationship was stuck in the past and nothing could bring back the warmth they once had. Jeff was a new beginning, a new horizon. He was confident, determined, and exciting, and he seemed like someone she could build something real with, unlike Kyle, who she felt was old and lost. Yet, increasingly, she felt like her connection with Jeff was destructive. At the same time, Jeff, like Tamira, was feeling the pressure. He wasn't ready to be the reason for the complete destruction of Kyle and Tamir's family, but his feelings for the woman were growing stronger with each passing day. He saw her not just as a lover, but as a woman he wanted to be with despite her marriage. Jeff himself felt that his actions could not be justified, that he was violating not only morality, but also something deeper, more incomprehensible than just cheating. A thought was brewing in his head. If Tamira decided to leave Kyle, what would happen to their relationship? How would everything be after they became open with her, if that happened at all? The moment Kyle realized that his fears were not unfounded, he finally decided to take the step he had been putting off for a long time. One evening, when Tamira returned late again, he met her with a look full of fear and resentment. His intuition told him that something was wrong. She was again in the same mood as before. Her silence was heavy and her face seemed cold, alien. Unable to contain himself any longer, he spoke. And though it was only one sentence, it carried all the force of pent-up despair. He said that if she continued to live with him as if they were no longer married, she would have to decide whether she was staying in this house at all. Kyle could no longer live in this ignorance. Tamira felt her husband's words hit her in the heart. She knew that sooner or later he would find out about her feelings for Jeff, but until now, she had managed to hide it. She was silent because she could not answer the question that was tormenting her. Who was she to Kyle? She was still trying to understand it, and her silence was the only way to avoid a conflict that she felt was no longer avoidable. Tamira didn't know what to say, and her eyes became empty and lifeless. Should she tell the truth, or continue to hide everything, hoping that it would disappear on its own? Every day it became more and more difficult for her to fight herself. All these emotions began to overwhelm her, and she felt like her own life had slipped out of her hands. Tamira began to realize that her relationship with Jeff had become much more than she could have ever imagined. Kyle knew at that moment that this was inevitable too. He was already making plans in his head about how he could deal with it. But no matter how hard he tried, he knew he couldn't control how this would affect his life. His wife was no longer the person he had once dreamed of spending his life with. Suddenly, the reality hit him. Their relationship had been on the brink of collapse for a long time, and his attempts to restore it had been futile. Tamira had lost her love for him, and perhaps had for a long time. Jeff continued his steps, retreating into the shadows. He felt his life with Tamira, approaching the moment when the truth would come out and he could no longer remain in the shadows. There was no room for doubt in his mind. After all, when it all came out, he was ready to face the consequences. As time went on, the atmosphere in the house grew thicker and more uneasy. Each day brought new tense moments. Every glance Kyle gave Tamir was filled with mistrust, and her coldness became his worst enemy. He was no longer able to believe in their relationship as he once did. There was no longer the usual softness on his face, only a heavy expression of determination and disappointment. Kyle still loved her, despite everything that had happened. But love, as it turned out, is not always able to survive such a storm. Tamira became more and more withdrawn with each passing day. She tried to find peace in her feelings, but the more time she spent away from Kyle, the more isolated she felt. She often came home late, not because of work, but rather because she sought solace in her other life, which she tried to hide. In the evenings, she spent time with Jeff, who became a refugee from everything that felt lost in her marriage. He was someone with whom she could be real, someone with whom she could talk about her feelings without fear of being judged. Jeff was becoming more and more dominant and confident. His relationship with Tamira was moving faster than he had expected. He knew that Tamira couldn't hide her feelings from Kyle for long, and although he was prepared to accept the consequences, his confidence was beginning to waver. He could see how much Tamira had changed, how withdrawn and anxious she had become, but her feelings for him were obvious. He felt that everything that had happened was part of an inescapable plan, a love that existed only in their small, protected world. Tamira tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy for everyone around her, including Kyle. She didn't want her relationship with Jeff to be the reason their lives were destroyed, but in reality, her own life had long since ceased to be what she once thought it would be. Her family, her love for her husband, her devotion, it had all melted away, and she knew the end was near. Kyle knew he had to act to maintain some stability. He couldn't remain in the shadow of his doubts and suspicions any longer. He noticed a change in Tamira. Her eyes had become cold and empty. Her nightly walks and refusal to communicate were becoming more and more obvious. He began to watch her, hoping to see some spark of the person he once loved. But there was no spark. Instead, he saw only emptiness and alienation. One such evening, when Tamira was late again, Kyle made a decision. He couldn't live with this burden of not knowing the whole truth any longer. He had to find out what was really going on in their lives. He started following her, and soon his suspicions were confirmed. She was dating Jeff. It was obvious. But what shocked him most was the realization of how deeply she was involved with him. Kyle was furious, but at the same time his mind remained cold. He couldn't let all this destroy him. His internal struggle was terrible because he still loved Tamir, but he couldn't be blind and inactive anymore. His love and pain intertwined, creating an avalanche of feelings that he couldn't stop. That night, when Tamira returned home, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. Kyle stood in front of her, his eyes full of despair and rage. Tamira felt the tension, but she still remained silent. There was an emptiness in her soul, but she could not tell Kyle the truth. She could not admit that her feelings for Jeff were so strong that she was ready to sever everything that connected her to this man with whom she once shared her life. But that night, something changed. In a fit of anger and frustration, Kyle, unable to contain his pain and rage, took a step that turned everything into an inescapable nightmare. Tamira saw him, But there was no longer the light in her eyes that had once sparkled in her gaze. She couldn't understand how it had come to this. That night their lives changed forever. The night Kyle took his first step toward destruction, he couldn't quite understand what had driven him to it. His anger, mixed with betrayal, was burning everything at that moment. He thought about his life, about his lost feelings and how he had gotten himself into this trap. But there were no clear thoughts in his head, only emotions that truly controlled his actions. He realized that he could not go back now. His hands shook and his heart beat fast as he watched Tamira stand before him, unaware that his mind was consumed by something dark and inescapable. In that moment, everything changed. Kyle didn't realize that this was more than a fit of anger. It was a turning point, a point of no return. His life, his family's life, the relationships that had once seemed sacred, all of it was falling apart. He was trapped in his own web of fear, pain, and powerlessness, and violence seemed the only way out. The moment of confrontation was the catalyst, and his rage was unleashed on the woman he had once held close. Everything that happened later was a result of those actions. At first, killing Tamir seemed absolutely justified. He was sure that she had betrayed him. He felt that without her destruction he would not be able to find peace. Kyle knew that he was losing his mind, but it was too late to turn back. He watched her life fade away before his eyes, and with every breath she took, every movement she made, he felt his own soul slipping into darkness. But there was one thing Kyle hadn't predicted. Her death brought no relief. He didn't feel relief or satisfaction. Instead, his soul sank deeper into the abyss. Now that Tamira was dead, he was beginning to feel in control again. He knew he couldn't go back to normal, and he knew he had to get rid of everyone involved in her death. His thoughts about Jeff, her lover, became obsessive. He couldn't let him live. This wasn't just revenge. It was the completion of what had started with the first glimpse of her betrayal. Jeff still didn't know what had happened to Tamira. He continued his usual routine, but he could already sense that something was wrong. He could feel his life beginning to crumble, though he didn't know what the threat was. His connection to Tamira, this secret, hidden connection, no longer had that magical sense of safety. He knew Kyle was getting closer, but he didn't realize how close he was to his own destruction. Kyle began to hunt him. It wasn't just murder. It was a dismembered perception of reality. Every step he took brought him closer to his goal. He decided that Jeff had to die the same way Tamira had. But killing him wasn't just a physical death. It was a necessary act to avenge his betrayal. He believed that getting rid of everyone connected to his grief was his last chance to restore his world. But the fear and pain that Kyle felt during the process were foreign to him. He felt like he was losing the last of his humanity. The moment he met Jeff, his eyes were empty. It wasn't a kill, it was a completion. And as his hands held the knife, there was absolute silence in his head. That moment was the culmination of his downfall. When he returned home, his life no longer existed in the form it had before the murders. Everything had fallen apart, and he realized that now there was only one thing left to do: hide from the consequences. After Kyle finished off Jeff, he felt his world descend into chaos. Fear for his safety, the knowledge that he could no longer return to normal, plagued him. But even more disturbing was the thought of Tammy, the way her death had left a deep wound, not just in his life, but in the lives of her loved ones. He knew he would have to face the consequences of his choices, but the moment he walked out of the house, his mind was as empty as his soul. The first few days after Jeff's murder were a blur for Kyle. He tried to hide from reality, but reality wouldn't let him disappear. He saw his hands covered in blood, and every time he looked in the mirror, his reflection became more distorted. Kyle couldn't shake the image of Tamir and Jeff. They haunted him, giving him no peace. But everything changed when he found out Tammy was pregnant. That was the moment his psyche finally broke. Tamira might not have been able to take it back, but the fact that he had taken her life not only shattered his soul, it left him with a mind that couldn't cope with that information. He didn't know if the baby was his or Jeff's, and perhaps that uncertainty was his most painful burden. He began to feel his world crumbling again. Tamira was more than just a woman. She was his lover, the mother of his unborn child, and she belonged to him. But her death, her disappearance, had now become his personal catastrophe. He knew he had to leave, disappear, and hide from everyone. But one thing remained constant. She would always be with him, in his head, like an obsessive memory that would not give him a day of peace. Kyle was hesitant to truly let go of her memory. Even with all his actions that had led to her death, he couldn't shake the feeling that she had left a void in his life. He was sure he needed to do something to complete his story, to restore order to his mind. But every step he took brought him closer to the break, and that break was inevitable. Kyle tried to forget, to try to start a new life, but it was impossible. He couldn't run from himself, from being a killer. He was a fugitive not only from the law, but from his own conscience. But there was one thought in his mind. He had to end this. His wife, Kyle, knew she would be with him anyway. She didn't know the truth, and her loyalty was in his hands, like a last chance. But the shadows of the past continued to fall on his consciousness, and he didn't know how long he could stay alive in this world. After Kyle had done a few desperate things, his condition continued to deteriorate. He couldn't stop thinking about Tammy and the consequences of his actions. But gradually, fear and paranoia took over. He lived in constant tension, expecting that at some point his actions would be judged, and he was right. In the weeks following Jeff's murder, police began to collect more and more leads from the crime scene. At first, they didn't connect him to Tammy's disappearance, but gradually, through several eyewitness accounts and CCTV footage, they were able to pinpoint his whereabouts on the night of the murder. This was a turning point in the investigation. Kyle tried to hide, moving from one safe place to another, but his conscience would not let go. He knew that he could not remain in the shadows forever, that sooner or later he would face the consequences of his actions. His internal struggle intensified. He increasingly wondered what to do with the rest of his life, knowing that he had ruined the lives of those he loved. He was caught late at night, exhausted and nearly broken, climbing into an abandoned building on the outskirts of Chicago. His face was drawn and his eyes were empty. The police surrounded him and, despite his attempts to resist, they took him into custody. He knew it was inevitable and surrendered without a fight. The next stage was even more excruciating, the trial. Kyle, now realizing the gravity of his actions, made no attempt to justify himself. He admitted his guilt and expressed regret, although it could not bring Tammy back and could not change what had been done. The doubts and internal torments that had plagued him throughout this time no longer mattered. The trial was harsh, but fair. The end of the story was inevitable. Kyle was sentenced to a long prison term where he would have to face the consequences he had created. In prison, he had to live with the knowledge that he had taken the lives of those dear to him, and he would have to live with that burden for the rest of his days.